I didn't raise my voice when she said, "We're not paying that bill," but I did lock every single one of them out of their own lake houses the next morning. The first thing you notice out there isn't the water. It's the silence when a gate doesn't open. No click, no motor hum, just wind moving across a perfectly still lake and a line of luxury homes sitting useless behind a steel barrier they suddenly can't get through. I remember the exact smell that morning, damp concrete mixed with lake water and fresh-cut grass, the kind of clean, expensive quiet that neighborhoods like this are built to protect. 12 houses, each one pushing 2 million easy. Boats docked, lights on timers, security systems blinking like everything was normal. Except it wasn't, because I was standing on the outside of the gate with the only set of keys that actually mattered. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I'm a civil engineer, water systems, shoreline reinforcement, structural access points, the kind of work nobody notices until something fails. And when it does fail, suddenly I'm the only name anyone remembers. That's how I ended up here in the first place. This lake, it wasn't always clean, stable, or worth what they're selling it for now. 15 years ago, it was a liability. Erosion chewing away at the banks, drainage issues, unstable dock foundations. I was the one who redesigned the entire system, retaining walls, runoff channels, the gated access road. Even the locking mechanism on that steel gate they were now staring at like it had betrayed them. Back then, they didn't treat me like an outsider. Back then, I was the guy who saved the lake. Margaret Holloway was the first to shake my hand. HOA president. Always perfectly dressed, always smiling like she was doing you a favor just by talking to you. She told me they needed someone they could trust. Someone who understood the land. I gave them exactly that. I gave them a shoreline that wouldn't collapse, docks that wouldn't drift, and access roads that held under pressure. What I didn't give them was ownership. And that's the part they either didn't understand or thing to ignore. See, while they were busy building their lakefront dream, I made sure every contract, every permit, every line of legal language tied one thing back to me. The infrastructure that made their entire neighborhood function. The road you drive in on. The gate that opens when you punch in your code. The dock your boat sits on. None of that belonged to the HOA. It never did. They just got comfortable pretending it did. And comfort has a way of making people careless. The night before all of this, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a single piece of paper. $63,500. That's what it cost me to fix the shoreline collapse after last winter's storms. 3 days of nonstop work. Equipment, labor, materials. I didn't cut corners. I never do. I sent the invoice the same day I finished. Thought it would be routine. Necessary repairs, clearly documented, tied directly to the structural integrity of the properties they were so proud of. Instead, I got a meeting. Margaret sat at the head of the table, hands folded, smile perfectly in place. "We appreciate your effort, Ethan," she said, voice smooth as glass. "But after reviewing the situation, the board has decided this falls outside HOA responsibility. Outside their responsibility." I remember the way the room smelled. Coffee gone cold, polished wood, that faint hint of perfume that always followed her around. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, just agreed like I understood. Because in that moment, I realized something they hadn't. They thought they were refusing a bill. What they were actually doing was testing who controlled the only door in and out of their perfect little lake. I have learned something about people who live behind gates like that. They think the barrier protects them from the outside world, but they never stop to ask who actually controls the barrier. That meeting ended with handshakes and fake smiles, but I could already feel the shift. The way Margaret avoided direct eye contact when I slid the invoice across the table. The way one of the board members tapped his pen like he was already done listening before I even finished explaining the structural risk. They were not evaluating the work. They were calculating how to avoid paying for it. I walked out of that clubhouse with the late afternoon sun hitting the lake just right, reflecting off water that I had stabilized with my own design, and for the first time, it did not feel like something I had built for them. It felt like leverage. The air smelled different that evening. Less like fresh-cut grass and more like something settling into place. I drove the entire perimeter road, slow, windows down, listening to the tires crunch over gravel transitions I had personally specified years ago. Every curve, every drainage slope, every reinforced edge was exactly where it needed to be. And every single one of those systems depended on access points that were written, in plain legal language, under my name. Not the HOA. Not the board. Mine. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun dipped below the tree line, turning the water into a sheet of dark glass. My phone buzzed before I even made it inside. An email. Subject line short and cold. Final determination. I opened it standing there in the fading light, reading each word slower than the last. They were doubling down, not only refusing payment, but stating that any further attempts to collect would be considered harassment under their community guidelines. I actually let out a quiet laugh at that. Harassment. The word echoed in my head while I stepped into my kitchen and set the phone down on the counter. They had just made this simple. Too simple. I poured a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and stared out toward the lake through the back window. You could see the faint outline of dock lights flickering on one by one as homeowners settled in for the night. Weekend crowd was already arriving. Boats tied up, coolers unloaded, music starting to drift across the water in low, distant waves. They were celebrating, completely unaware of how fragile that access really was. I finished the water and walked into my office, flipping on the desk lamp that cast a clean circle of light over a stack of documents I had not needed to touch in years. Original contracts, easement agreements, access control rights. I slid one page forward, fingers tracing a single paragraph I remembered writing. Into the agreement myself. Clear. Uncomplicated. Absolutely. All primary access routes and controlled entry systems remain under the sole authority of the infrastructure owner in the event of unresolved financial dispute. No ambiguity. No loophole. Just a line they had never expected to matter. I checked the time. Just past 8. Still enough daylight left for one phone call. The locksmith answered on the second ring. I kept it simple. I needed a full lock replacement on a private gate. Commercial grade. Early morning. No delays. He asked for the address, quoted the job, and I agreed without hesitation. When I hung up, the house felt completely still. No tension. No hesitation. Just a quiet certainty settling in. Outside, the lake carried on like nothing had changed. Lights glowing. Water moving. People laughing somewhere in the distance. They thought the situation ended in that meeting room. They thought ignoring a bill meant closing a chapter. What they did not understand was that the real decision had just been made. And by the time the sun came up, the only thing that would still open in that entire neighborhood would be the realization that they had misjudged exactly who they were dealing with. I woke up before sunrise, the kind of early where the air still holds onto the night and everything feels paused, like the world has not decided what it wants to be yet. The lake was quiet, no boats, no voices, just a thin layer of mist hovering over the water like it was trying to hide something. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hand and listened for a second. No engines. No music. Just wind brushing against the surface and the faint creak of dock cables adjusting with the current. It was the kind of calm that makes people forget how quickly things can change. The locksmith's truck rolled in at exactly 6:15, tires crunching over the gravel with a steady rhythm that echoed more than usual in the stillness. He stepped out, took one look at the gate, and nodded like he already understood the job without asking questions. I appreciated that. Some people know when it is better to focus on the work instead of the story behind it. We walked up to the control panel together, the metal still cold from the night air. I handed him the documentation, proof of ownership, access authority, everything clean and official. He scanned it, gave a short nod, and got to work. The first sound was the click of tools against steel, sharp and precise. Then came the low hum of the motor housing being opened, followed by the dull clank of internal components being disengaged. It was not loud, but it carried. Sound travels differently over water. By the time he finished replacing the lock cylinder and resetting the access system, the sun had just started to break over the tree line, casting long shadows across the road leading into the community. The new keypad reads up with a clean, soft glow. Fresh system. New codes. Full control. I stood there for a second after he packed up, just looking at it. Same gate. Same structure. But now it actually belonged to the person who had always owned it. He handed me the final key, heavier than the old one, solid in a way that felt intentional. I slipped it into my pocket without saying much. Payment handled. No delays. He drove off, just as the first car appeared at the far end of the road. A black SUV, slow at first, then stopping completely when the driver realized the gate was not responding. I watched from a distance, leaning slightly against the fence line, coffee still warm in my hand. The driver punched in the code once. Then again. At third time, harder, like pressing the buttons with more force would somehow change the outcome. Nothing. The gate didn't move. The silence after each attempt stretched longer than it should have. Eventually the window rolled down, and I could see the confusion start to settle in. That was the moment it began. Within minutes, another car pulled up behind the first. Then another. Engines idling. Doors opening. People stepping out, looking at the keypad, at the gate, at each other. You could hear the shift in tone even from where I was standing. At first it was annoyance, then frustration, then something sharper. Phones came out. Calls were made. Names were said. Margaret's name louder than the others. I took another sip of coffee and let the moment breathe. This was not chaos. This was structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. Access granted or denied. Nothing personal. Just a system responding to a condition that had not been met. And right now, that condition was simple. An unpaid bill sitting on my desk. The morning light grew stronger, reflecting off the water behind them, turning the lake into something almost blinding if you looked at it too long. They had everything they paid for. The houses, the docks, the view. The only thing they didn't have anymore was the ability to reach it. And as I watched Margaret's white sedan finally pull up to the front of the growing line, stepping out with that same controlled expression she always carried, I realized something that settled deeper than any contract clause ever could. They still thought this was a misunderstanding. They still believed this was something that could be talked through, negotiated, softened with the right words. But standing there with the only working key in my pocket, listening to the quiet tension building in the air, I knew exactly what this was. Not an argument, not a dispute, just a system finally responding to reality. Margaret did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed as she stepped out of her car. While the others were pacing, pointing at the keypad, raising their voices just enough to let frustration leak into the morning air, she stayed composed. Sunglasses on, posture straight, heels clicking softly against the pavement as she walked toward the gate like she still expected it to respond to her presence alone. That kind of confidence does not come from understanding a situation. It comes from being used to controlling it. She pressed the keypad once, slow and deliberate, entering the same code she had probably used for years. The small green light flickered, then died. No sound, no movement, just that same quiet refusal. She tried again, this time glancing briefly at the growing line of residents behind her, as if their attention alone might force the system to cooperate. When it did not, she turned slightly, scanning the area, and that was when she saw me. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I just stood there on the other side of the fence line, coffee cup in hand, watching the moment settle in. You could almost see the shift happening behind her sunglasses. Recognition first, then calculation, then something tighter, something less controlled. She walked over, each step measured, stopping a few feet away from where I stood. Up close, I could catch the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the cool lake air, sharp and out of place against the natural stillness of the morning. "Ethan," she said, voice calm, almost conversational. "There seems to be an issue with the gate." I took a slow sip before answering, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the words land heavier. "It is not an issue," I said. "It is a response." That was the first crack. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough. Her jaw tightened slightly, the kind of reaction most people would miss if they were not looking for it. Behind her, someone called out asking what was going on, another voice suggesting they contact security, as if security had anything to do with this. Margaret didn't turn around. She kept her attention on me. "You cannot restrict access like this," she said, tone still controlled but thinner now, less certain. "These are private residences." I listened once, slowly, deliberately. "They are," I said, "and the access to them runs through infrastructure that you do not own." The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the water and carrying the faint sound of waves tapping against the dock pilings in the distance. It was a steady rhythm, almost like a clock marking time. She crossed her arms, a small shift in posture that said more than her words did. "If this is about the invoice," she said, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation contained, "we can discuss that through proper channels." Proper channels. I had heard that phrase before. It usually meant delay, deflect, deny. I set the coffee cup down on the fence post beside me, the ceramic making a soft contact against the wood. "We already did discuss it," I said. "You made your decision." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the idling engines behind her and the low murmur of residents starting to realize this was not going to be resolved in the next few minutes. One of them tried the keypad again, harder this time, as if force could replace authority. It didn't. Margaret exhaled slowly, removing her sunglasses and looking at me directly for the first time. Her eyes were sharp, focused, searching for something she could still control. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" she asked. There it was. Not confusing anymore. Not dismissal. A real question, even if she didn't like the answer. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the new key, and held it up just enough for her to see the clean, unmarked metal catching the morning light. "I am enforcing the terms of an agreement," I said. "One thing you ignore." The reaction behind her shifted again, voices getting louder now, questions turning into demands. Someone mentioned lawyers. Someone else said this had to be illegal. I almost smiled at that. Margaret glanced back at them for a split second, then returned her attention to me. The calculation in her expression sharper now, faster. She was adjusting. That was what she did best. But the difference this time was simple. She was reacting. And for the first time since I had met her, she was not the one setting the rules of the situation. The gate stood between us, silent and unmoving, exactly as it was designed to be. And in that stillness, with the lake stretching out behind her like something she could see but no longer reach, the reality finally started to settle in. This was not a conversation she could manage. This was a condition she had already triggered. The crowd behind her was no longer pretending to stay calm. What started as a few confused voices had turned into overlapping questions, sharper tones cutting through the quiet morning air like something finally breaking loose. Car doors slammed. Engines shut off. People stepped out, walking closer to the gate, trying to see what was happening, trying to understand why something that had always worked was suddenly refusing them. I could hear fragments of conversation drifting across the distance. Someone talking about a weekend event they were going to miss. Another complaining about a boat rental, already paid for. One voice, louder than the rest, asking why the HOA had not fixed this already. That last one hung in the air longer than the others. Margaret heard it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders shifted, just slightly, like the weight of those expectations had landed all at once. She turned halfway toward them, raising a hand just enough to signal control, the same motion she had probably used 100 times in meetings to quiet a room. "There is a temporary access issue," she said, projecting her voice with practiced clarity. "We are handling it." Temporary. The word felt almost out of place in the moment. I leaned back slightly against the fence, watching how quickly people accepted it, or at least pretended to. A few heard. Others looked unconvinced but stayed quiet, waiting for her to fix it like she always had. That was the expectation she had built. That was the system she relied on. But systems only hold as long as the foundation under them is real. She turned back to me, lowering her voice again, stepping closer this time, close enough that the distance between us felt intentional, measured. "You are making a mistake," she said, each word more deliberate than the last. "This is not how these matters are resolved." I let that sit for a second, listening to the faint ripple of water against the shoreline behind her, steady and unaffected by anything happening on land. "It already is resolved," I said. "You just don't like the outcome." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like she was recalculating the situation in real time. "You think this gives you leverage," she said. "All it does is expose you." I almost smiled at that, but didn't. Instead, I reached down and picked up the folder I had brought with me, flipping it open just enough to reveal the top page. Official documents. Clean, stamped, signed. I didn't hand it to her. I didn't need to. "Everything here is documented," I said. "Ownership, access rights, enforcement clauses. You were aware of them when you signed the agreement." She didn't look at the folder. She didn't need either. She knew. That was the difference between uncertainty and denial. Behind her, the tension continued to build. Someone tried to call the property management company. Another mentioned contacting law enforcement. The words carried a certain urgency now, but also hesitation, like they were not entirely sure who would be in the right once those calls were made. Margaret glanced back again, longer this time, and for a brief moment, I saw something shift in her expression. No fear. Don't panic. Just the realization that the situation was no longer contained. When she turned back to me, the tone had changed. Not softer, just more direct. What do you want? She asked. Simple question. Clear. No performance. I appreciated that. I closed the folder slowly, letting the sound of the paper settle into the quiet between us. I already told you, I said. The invoice. She exhaled through her nose, a controlled release, like she was managing the reaction instead of letting it show. You are holding an entire community hostage over a bill, she said. The word hostage hung there, heavy but inaccurate. I shook my head once. No, I said. I am enforcing a contract you thing to ignore. The distinction matters. The difference between control and consequence. The sun was higher now, burning off the last of the mist over the lake, revealing the full stretch of water behind her. Calm, accessible, just out of reach. And as the voices behind her grew louder, as the questions turned into pressure, as the expectation for her to fix this tightened around her like something closing in, the reality became impossible to avoid. This was no longer about whether the gate would open. It was about whether she was willing to admit why it would not. The word hung there between us longer than anything else she had said that morning. What do you want? It was no longer a question about control. It was a question about damage. I could hear it in the way the voices behind her shifted again, less scattered now, more focused, like the crowd had started to understand that whatever was happening here was not a glitch or a broken system. It was a decision. A few of them moved closer, not crossing the invisible line Margaret had created, but close enough to listen, close enough to realize. This was not going away in 5 minutes. I watched her process it, the way her eyes moved slightly, not looking at me anymore but past me, like she was already thinking 3 steps ahead, trying to find a path that did not involve giving in. That was her instinct, not resolved. Positioning. You are asking for immediate payment, she said, choosing her words carefully, like she was building a case even as she spoke. That is not how a board operates. There are procedures, approvals, financial reviews. I nodded once, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the structure she was trying to hide behind. There were procedures, I said. You think not to use them. The wind picked up again, carrying the sharper scent of lake water now that the sun had burned off the last of the cool morning. It mixed with the faint smell of asphalt from the road and something metallic from the gate itself, like the entire place was reminding everyone what it was made of. Not promised, not opinions, materials, systems, agreements. Margaret crossed her arms again, but this time it was different, less composed, more defensive. You expect us to authorize $63,500 on demand, she said. Without review, without verification. I reached into the folder again, pulling out a single page and holding it up just enough for her to see the header. Itemized costs, labor hours, material breakdown, signed completion report. You already verified it, I said. You just decided not to honor it. That landed. Not loudly, but cleanly. Behind her, someone spoke up, louder than before. If this is about money, just pay him and open the gate. Another voice followed, agreeing, frustration starting to turn into pressure. The shift was happening faster now. Not toward me, towards her. Margaret didn't turn around this time. She stayed locked in place, eyes on me, but I could see it in the tension along her jaw. The board was no longer a shield. It was becoming a liability. You are creating a situation that will escalate, she said, voice lower now, more direct, less performance. This does not end well for anyone. I let out a slow breath, not reacting to the warning, just letting it settle into the air between us. It ends the moment the agreement is honored, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. For a second, the only sound was the lake behind her, steady and indifferent, the same rhythm it always had. That it did not care about contracts or disputes. It just followed its own rules. Margaret looked down briefly, then back up, like she was measuring the distance between options that were all getting smaller. Even if I wanted to move forward, she said, I cannot make that decision alone. There it was. The first real admission. Not refused. Not deflection. Limitation. I nodded slightly, because that part was true, but it didn't change anything. Then you should have thought about that before you refused, I said. The words were not sharp, just final. Behind her, the pressure continued to build. Voices no longer asking what was happening, but why it had not been fixed yet. Phones were still out, but now they were being used differently, not to call for help, but to record, to document, to capture the moment where control slipped. Margaret could feel it. Anyone in her position would. She glanced back again, along this time, seeing not just a group of homeowners, but expectations turning into accountability. When she faced me again, the confidence was still there, but it had changed shape. Less absolute, more calculated. "If I get the board on an emergency call," she said, "you will restore access immediately." It wasn't a question. It was an attempt to regain ground. I considered it for a second, not because I needed to, but because letting silence exist there mattered. "Access is restored when the payment is confirmed," I said. Not before. The difference was small in words, but absolute in outcome. The kind of difference you cannot negotiate around. And as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the locked gate and the line of cars behind it, the situation settled into something clear and unavoidable. This was no longer about authority. It was about consequence catching up to a decision that had already been made. Margaret did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said. It was not hesitation. It was calculated under pressure. Behind her, the noise had shifted again, no longer scattered complaints, but focused frustration, voices tightening into something that demanded resolution instead of waiting for it. I could hear names now, specific ones, board members being called out, questions about dues, about authority, about why something this simple had turned into a public standoff at the front gate. The kind of questions that do not disappear once they are asked out loud. Margaret stepped slightly to the side, pulling her phone from her bag with a smooth, controlled motion, but her grip was tighter than before. She turned her back halfway to me, just enough to create a barrier, and started dialing. The moment she did, the crowd quieted just a little, like everyone understood this was the part where things either moved forward or fell apart. I stayed where I was, hands resting lightly against the top of the fence, feeling the warmth of the sun starting to replace the cool of the morning air. The lake behind them had fully come into view now. No mist left, just open water stretching out like something permanent, something stable, something they assumed would always be theirs to access. That was assumption doing most of the work right now. Margaret spoke in a low voice into the phone, but not low enough to hide the urgency in it. Short sentences. Direct language. No explanation beyond what was necessary. She was not presenting options. She was presenting a problem that needed to be solved immediately. I could hear one side of the conversation through her tone alone. Resistance at first. Questions. Then a break. Then something shifting. The kind of shift that happens when people realize the situation is already visible, already out of their control. She paced once, small, measured steps, heels clicking softly against the pavement, the sound sharp in the quiet gaps between voices behind her. Someone near the front muttered that this was ridiculous. Another said they had guests arriving in an hour. The pressure was no longer building. It was compressing, tightening around a single point. Margaret stopped pacing and turned slightly, still on. The phone, eyes finding mine again for just a second. Not confrontation this time. Assessment. She was checking if anything about my position had changed. It had not. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, letting the situation exist exactly as it was. After another moment, she ended the call and lowered the phone slowly, taking a breath that was just controlled enough to pass as calm if you were not paying attention. She stepped back toward me, closing the distance again, the line between us still defined by the gate that had not moved an inch since this started. "They are reviewing it now," she said. Not defensive, not dismissive, just stating the next step. Behind her, a few people leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word, like this was the only conversation that mattered anymore. I nodded once, acknowledging the movement without reacting to it. "Good," I said. The word was simple, but it carried weight. Not approved. Just confirmation that the process was finally happening the way it should have from the beginning. She held my gaze for a second longer, then added, "If this goes through, you will restore access immediately." It was closer to a request this time, even if she did not frame it that way. I let the silence sit between us again, the kind of pause that makes people listen more carefully than any answer would. "The moment the payment is confirmed," I said. Same words, same condition, nothing added, removed nothing. The consistency matters. It leaves no space for interpretation. Behind her, the crowd shifted again, But this time it was different. Less scattered. More aligned. People were no longer questioning what was happening. They were waiting to see how it would end. Waiting to see if the system they trusted would actually respond when it mattered. The sun was higher now, heat starting to rise off the pavement, the smell of warmed asphalt mixing with the lake air in a way that felt heavier, more grounded. Time was moving forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. Margaret glanced back once more at the line of residents, then returned her attention to me, her expression sharper now, focused in a way that did not rely on control anymore. It relied on outcome. And for the first time since this started, she did not try to reframe the situation or redirect it. She simply stood there, waiting, just like everyone else, for a decision that would either open the gate or prove that it was never really theirs to begin with. Time has a way of stretching when everything depends on a single outcome. Minutes feel longer. Sounds carry further. Even the smallest movements start to matter. I could hear it in the way the conversations behind Margaret shifted into quieter tones, like people were conserving energy, waiting instead of reacting. The earlier frustration had not disappeared, but it had settled into something more focused, something that knew this was no longer about guessing what would happen next. It was about watching it unfold in real time. Margaret's phone remained in her hand, her thumb resting lightly against the screen, not moving, not dialing again. She was waiting now, just like the rest of them. That was the difference. The person who usually controlled the timing of everything had been pulled into the same rhythm as everyone else. The sun climbed higher, casting a sharper light across the gate, reflecting off the metal in a way that made it almost too bright to look at directly. The keypad sat there, silent, its soft glow unchanged, a constant reminder that nothing had been broken. Nothing had failed. The system was working exactly as it was supposed to. A breeze rolled in off the lake, stronger now, carrying the scent of water and something faintly mineral, like wet stone warming under the sun. It brushed past the line of cars, moving through open windows, shifting loose papers on dashboards, rustling the edges of documents some of them had started pulling out, as if preparing for something official. I noticed one man near the front scrolling through emails, probably trying to find something, anything, that would explain this from his side. Another woman stood with her arms crossed, staring at the gate like it had personally betrayed her. But none of them were looking at the right place. The answer was not in the gate. It never was. Margaret's phone finally vibrated. It was a small sound, but in that moment, it cut through everything. She looked down immediately, her expression tightening just enough to show that whatever was on that screen mattered. She read it once, then again, slower the second time. I looked at her face, not the phone. That is where the real information always is. The control she had been holding onto did not disappear, but it shifted. Less rigid. More contained. She exhaled quietly, almost too subtle to notice, then lifted her eyes back to mine. There was no speech this time. No framing. No attempt to shape the moment. Just a simple statement. The payment is being processed, she said. Behind her, the words moved faster than sound. You could see it ripple through the group before you could hear it. Heads turning, shoulders relaxing slightly. Someone letting out a breath they didn't realize they had been holding. It was not celebrated. Not yet. Just relief starting to take shape. I nodded once, reaching into my pocket again, feeling the weight of the key between my fingers before I pulled it out. The metal caught the sunlight, reflecting it back in a clean, sharp line. Margaret's eyes followed the movement, focused, steady, but different now. Not assessed. Not calculated. Just watching. I stepped forward toward the control panel, the gravel shifting under my boots with a familiar crunch that echoed more than usual in the quiet that had settled over the group. Every sound felt amplified now, like the moment itself was narrowing down to a single point. I inserted the key slowly, not for effect, but because there was no reason to rush. The mechanism responded immediately, a solid, mechanical click that carried through the air with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. That sound meant something had changed. I entered the new code, each number deliberately, the soft beep of the keypad marking each step like a countdown reaching its end. For a split second, everything held still. Then the gate moved. A low hum built inside the motor housing, followed by the steady motion of steel sliding open, inch by inch, until the barrier that had held everything in place all morning finally gave way. The space beyond. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Same road. Same view. Same lake stretching out in the distance. But the meaning of it had changed. As the first car started forward, slow at first, then more certain, the entire line followed. Engines coming back to life one by one. Movement returning to a place that had been frozen just minutes before. Margaret stepped aside, letting them pass, her posture straight again, her composition restored, at least on the surface. When she looked back at me, there was no smile this time. No performance. Just a quiet understanding settling into place. The system had worked. Not the one she controlled. The one she had tried to ignore. The last car rolled through the gates slower than the rest, like the driver wanted to make sure it was real before committing to it. Tires crossed the threshold, gravel crunching under weight that had been held back just minutes before, and then it was over. The line was gone. Engines faded into the distance, replaced by the familiar quiet of a place returning to its routine. Boats would be untied. Doors would open. Music would start again. From the outside, nothing about the lake had changed. But I stood there for a moment longer, watching the gate finish its full cycle, listening to the motor settle back into silence, feeling the shift that most of them would never fully understand. Margaret had not moved far. She stood just off to the side, arms no longer crossed, phone lowered, posture still controlled but no longer rigid. The performance was gone. What remained was something simpler. Recognition, not of defeat, but of reality. Left to say, the kind of silence that only exists after something has already been decided. The breeze picked up again, lighter now, carrying the distant sound of water against docks, and faint laughter returning somewhere deeper inside the community. Life was summarizing, exactly the way it always does once the immediate problem is out of the way. But some things do not reset that easily. Margaret adjusted her sunglasses, placing them back on with a motion that felt automatic, practiced, like she was stepping back into the role she had held before all of this started. The board will want to review the agreement terms again, she said. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of what would come next. I said once. They should, I said. They signed them. That was the part people forget. Agreements do not change when they become inconvenient. They only become more visible. She gave a small, controlled exhale, something between acceptance and recalibration, then turned back toward the road, already shifting her attention to the next problem, the next conversation, the next version of control she could rebuild from what was left. I watched her walk away for a second, the sound of her heels fading into the background noise of a place that had already moved on from the moment that defined it. When the area finally cleared, I stepped back toward the control panel, resting my hand briefly against the metal surface, still warm from the sun. The keypad glowed the same way it always had. Neutral, unaffected, ready for the next input. I reset the temporary override, returning the system to its standard configuration, not because I had to, but because the point had already been made. Access had never been random. It had always followed a condition. That condition had just been enforced. I picked up my empty coffee cup from the fence post, the ceramic cool now, and took one last look at the road stretching toward the lake. From this angle, it looked like it always did. Clean, open, inviting. The kind of place people pay a lot of money to feel secure in. But security is not just gates and codes and rules written on paper. It is understanding who those systems actually belong to when it matters. I turned and walked back toward my truck, gravel shifting under each step, the sound steady and familiar. The same rhythm I had heard the night before when everything was still just a decision waiting to be made. As I opened the door and stepped inside, I paused for a second, looking out through the windshield at the gate one more time. It stood there, silent again, just another piece of infrastructure doing its job without question. Most people would forget about this by next weekend. They would talk about it once or twice, maybe shake their heads, maybe laugh about how inconvenient it was. But the part that would stay, the part that mattered, was not the inconvenience. It was the understanding that came with it. They had not been locked out because something broke. They had been locked out because something was finally enforced. And once people see that line, once they understand where control actually sits, it changes the way they approach everything that comes after. I started the engine, the low hum filling the cab, and pulled away from the gate without looking back again. There was nothing left to check, nothing left to prove. The system had done exactly what it was built to do. And for the first time since I built it, everyone involved finally understood why.